Dr. Andrew Hobbs, a senior lecturer in international journalism at the University of Central Lancashire, and a former journalist. And my special interest for research is how publications create a sense of place, sort of local identities, regional identities. So I'm interested in 19th century local newspapers and 20th century county magazines. So I will begin. So I'm looking at a county magazine and thinking about time and this particular genre of magazine, and applying Margaret Beetham's ideas of open and close and periodical time. So it's a county magazine, so I'm going to explain a little bit about what a county is, because not every country may have counties. So it's an administrative unit. Some of the counties in England are 1,000 years old, dating back to tribal areas or former principalities. By the 19th century, counties were administered politically and through military or organisation of military defence by the aristocracy and the gentry within each county, sort of the old wealthy and powerful families. And they would meet probably every 3 months for purposes of justice, political administration and administration of military affairs, as I said, things like meetings of county magistrates, lieutenancy meetings or assizes, the courts. And these events were also the focus of social events, so balls, assemblies, kind of a marriage market amongst those families. So there's quite an important social life. So that's the sort of history of it as an administrative unit. But there's also cultural associations of the county, particularly in England, and these sort of associations, which the magazines took great care to benefit from. So this genre of magazines in the UK, it's not exclusively a UK type of magazine. I know they have them in France and in the United States, and I'd be interested to hear if they have them in your country. It's quite a big magazine genre, and they were more or less invented in the late 1920s and early 1930s. So provincial magazines have been going for 100, 200 years, 150 years. And then in the 1890s, there's a national magazine called Country Life, kind of the view of the countryside from the big house. So things like hunting, antiques, gardens, architecture, a sort of high culture magazine, but about the countryside. And then in 1927, there was a new magazine, quite a progressive magazine called the Countryman, which was interested in the countryside, but from a very different point of view. That had an influence. And then there was a national movement that was trying to revive the countryside, that was concerned about rural decline. There were these county-level community councils around the country, which produced magazines. And all of these produced this new genre of the county magazine. So, and they were invented in the 20s, took off in the 30s, and became really popular after the Second World War in the 1940s, and they're still around today. So this particular magazine, Cheshire Life, Cheshire as a county is one of the more wealthy counties. It's in the northwest of England, you can see in the small inset map, and it borders on Lancashire, where the two big cities of Liverpool and Manchester can be found. There's no big cities in Cheshire itself. What else do you need to know? So it's a commuter area for those big cities. And the magazine was started in 1934 by a group of friends who somehow managed to get this magazine attached to a new economic development body that during the 1930s depression was trying to promote economic investment into Cheshire. So a little bit like USSR in construction, it was trying to bring money into the area to reduce unemployment. So that's the county and that's the magazine. And I'm going to apply this idea of rural modernity. This is how I'm going to sort of bring time into this, which I found a very useful way of analysing these magazines. And we don't actually see that many pictures that focus on things like electricity pylons, sort of modernity in the countryside. It's not considered picturesque, and so they're rarely photographed or painted. And yet, you know, they're everywhere in the countryside. So the idea of rural modernity, it challenges ideas that progress is urban and that the rural is unchanging. It challenges the idea that the urban and the rural are not connected, but we see how the connection happens there. We see that through things like suburbs, commuting, roads, consumption. And rural modernity challenges the idea of aesthetic hierarchies, which might put modernism above middlebrow or popular periodical forms. And some of the names that you might come across in this field are Kristin Blumel from Canada and Rosemary Shirley from the UK. So that's rural modernity. So I looked at the first 6 years of this magazine from 1934 to 1939. And for its first year, it was published by this Cheshire Publicity and Industrial Development Council, this economic development body of the great and the good from around the county, a mixture of gentry and bureaucrats, sort of progressive bureaucrats or more conservative gentry. Then after a year, I think it was losing money, and it was taken over by a commercial publisher who mainly published books, C. Nichols and Company, based in Manchester. And things began to change really, really rapidly in the magazine. And the dotted line down the middle is where the magazine changed hands. Still with the same editor for the next couple of years, although I don't know how much of an effect this editor had on the magazine. So we can see that the number of pages per issue started going up slightly after the new publisher took over. And the percentage of the magazine that was advertising, which is always a rough guide to how much money it's making, that started to go up as well. And if the number of pages are going up and the ad ratio is going up, then you know there's a lot of extra advertising in there. So it was launched in 1934. The first volume, it was a monthly, it ran for a year. And here, rural modernity could be seen in this early magazine, but rural modernity meant things like infrastructure, innovation, and industry. And then when it was taken over by a commercial publisher, there was a period of experimentation for a couple of years, and then a kind of maturity in the last couple of years before the Second World War. And here, rural modernity meant very different things: consumerism, display, and wealth. And there were immediate changes. The very month that the new publisher took over, the magazine looked quite significantly different. It had a full-page photo portrait at the front, exactly like Country Life magazine. It had a new series on Cheshire's big houses, its great palaces and country houses, and the families that lived there, so a mixture of past and present. There were photographs of social events, and there were photographs of society weddings, sort of rich people getting married, seeing the results of the marriage market, I suppose. And from what I know, I'm looking at, this is work in progress, but I'm looking at county magazines as a national phenomenon. I've developed a very bad eBay habit, so I've bought these magazines from all around the country. And from what I can see, these sort of more consumerist, wealth-orientated features appeared first in this particular magazine, Cheshire Life, and then rapidly spread to other similar magazines around the country. I have done some quantitative analysis. I did look at, as I promised in the abstract, how many of the adverts and the editorial items and the photographs could be classified as about the past, the present, or the future. But it was overwhelmingly about the present, hardly anything about the past, just a few historical articles here and there, hardly anything, a little bit about the future. So I haven't bothered putting that graph in there, but it's very, very, very much about the present. And at first I was really disappointed because it took ages sort of counting all and classifying all this material. Then I thought, that wasn't a certainty. I've looked at later county magazines which were much more about the past. So that was still a useful finding, if time-consuming. But just looking at the editorial images and the advertising images, we can see how the content changed quite rapidly from those first 2 years. So there were photographs of industrial places and processes, they virtually disappeared. Those country houses, they virtually disappeared. And the new material came in, fashion, cars, weddings, engagements, and social events. And then the advertising images, again, a sort of similar break. So I think the first year of the magazine was restricted to the county. It was trying to bring money into the county, and it was about the industry and the employment of the county. It seems that the people who were featured in the magazine after those first 2 years lived on a bigger map beyond the county, so the county maps disappeared. That's my theory. There were big commercial vehicles like buses and trucks. There were pictures of factories, which you do not find in these fancy county magazines anymore. Then the new material came in, houses for sale increased, fashion, beauty, furniture and cars. So let's look at the first year when it was still run by this non-profit sort of economic development council. So there's a focus on industry, there were updates on new industrial processes. I think a firm near Stockport was producing hundreds and thousands of India rubber balls per week, and it was leading the world in India rubber ball production. And infrastructure, quite a lot of the advertising was about electricity, which places were covered by different electricity companies or transport infrastructure. And innovation. I love this picture, I love the caption, exit Dobbin. So Dobbin is a popular name for a horse in the UK. So this is about motorised delivery of milk. So again, example of rural modernity, that tractors, motorised transport on the farm was a really significant thing in the countryside, and similar here. So bye-bye Dobbin, hello milk delivery van. Another innovation, this is mentioned in the first few issues of the paper, but a new phenomenon is kind of the roadhouse or the country club, which was kind of imported from America. And in Cheshire, they were using these stately homes and big old country houses that were being sold off and converting them, adding a golf course, a swimming pool, a ballroom, bars where you could come and maybe stay overnight, and that sort of hedonistic 30s lifestyle. And there's a nice quote there talking about three opened up within about a year in Cheshire. And so the magazine is supporting this innovation and saying it could be worse. And then under new owners, this commercial publisher who was only interested in this magazine if they could make money out of it, had no other interest to them at all, really, I don't think. And still modernity, but a very different type of modernity. So much more consumerism, lots of fashion adverts. This is a back page advert from Samuel's of Manchester. A rare example of kind of modernist design in this magazine, very little modernist design, but nice illustrations from an advert and an editorial image of that lovely perky little hat. Another very rare modernist image of a streamlined car. So the car advertising hugely increased under the new owners. And editorial about motoring. Although this began in the first phase of the magazine, motoring became a fixture both in editorial and in advertising. And I really like the idea of David Matlas, this idea of a motoring pastoral. Motoring became styled as a modern practice in pursuit of an older England. You drive to the countryside to look at old things and to look at the unchanging English countryside. And then this idea of display and wealth really took off, I think heavily influenced by the national magazine Country Life. So they were called Girls in Pearls. debutantes wearing pearl necklaces. This particular example doesn't have a pearl necklace on. Taken directly from Country Life, a direct steal. As we know, periodicals are incredibly, what's the word? They're very good at stealing things and quite unashamedly. So yeah, various sort of heiresses and debutantes and newly married people. That's the Lady Delamere. Okay, and then this other new feature of photo pages of social events. I haven't actually got one of weddings, but there are often 2 or 3 pages of society weddings with a little paragraph under each. But people, we all know these debutantes, don't we? We're always knocking around with them. And then here's a particular debutante on the right-hand page, her coming out dance, her dance to announce that she would be presented at court in London, and very clearly on the marriage market available for rich young men to propose to. So, sorry. Just a few other things about this new content. Looking at the magazine as a whole, as I said, sort of the maps disappeared and its geographical scope grew. And reading the magazine and the adverts, particularly the fashion adverts, they're mainly advertising businesses in the 2 big cities neighbouring Cheshire, Manchester and Liverpool. So the magazine seems to suggest that you can have a very rewarding, comfortable, wealthy, rural life, but it does involve frequent visits to town, and that might be Manchester or Liverpool, or it might be to London for the season. There's a quote in a gossip column talking about, things are a bit quiet in Cheshire during the summer. Everyone's gone to London for the season, which was things like social and sporting events around London and the home counties. So there's sort of the centres and the peripheries are shifting a little bit, almost by the time of year, according to this idea of the Cheshire set, the county set. And I know that Mary will talk about shifting centres and peripheries in her paper. So to conclude, just to add to a couple of those things on screen, things I thought of later. So the way that the county was represented in this particular magazine, it moved from being a unit of administration. This is an area in which we want to bring in economic development, to the county as the county set, the wealthy society people. In English, in England, we sometimes you even use it as an adjective. That's a very county outfit you're wearing, or that's a very county type of event to attend. So it still has some sort of cachet. Particularly, I think county magazines are desperately trying to keep that cachet going into the 21st century. So yeah, a few conclusions. Sorry, what have I done here? Let me just go back to the conclusion. Right. So yeah, thinking about core and periphery, I'm interested in regional and provincial publishing, and I think one of the things that interests me is that it creates lots of centres and lots of cores around and across a nation, and each one becomes its own centre and sees the rest of the world as peripheral and this one small town or county as central. It's an unusual publishing category. We're more used to looking at national periodicals, regional or local periodicals. So I think it's interesting as an anomaly almost. And this change that I've talked about from an economic development magazine to a high society magazine raises questions of like, why do we say that, the Times of London, which was founded in 1788, we still think of it as the same newspaper as the one that was published this morning, more than 200 years later. But why do we think it's the same? And this magazine changed radically, again, going back to Margaret Beetham's idea about the periodical form as being open in one way, as you know, it can always has new information in it. It always might change slightly, but also closed, following certain generic rules. And I think this change in the magazine really pushed the idea of open to the limit. It's only the title, Cheshire Life, and its monthly frequency that remained the same. And the sense of belonging, as I mentioned, moved from the county to more about belonging to a social class or a social set. And then this idea of rural modernity, I think Cheshire Life was firmly in the present. But despite those rapid changes, I think it still had a very clear sense of itself, and like most periodicals, as Anne-Marie was talking about, a sense of its history, and it would refer back to that founding year and those early years, and not try and airbrush it out of its history. But yeah, that's Cheshire Life firmly in the present. Thank you.